Hey friends, thanks for joining. Welcome to Breville's Masterclass for how to dial in the Barista Express. I'm Matt Davis, product expert for Coffee with Breville. If you're tuning in with a live chat, feel free to ask questions throughout the class. We have a team of experts from Breville that are ready to answer your questions. If you're watching on the on-demand version, feel free to email your questions to brevillebarista@brevilleusa.com. I'm so excited to be here. Now let's make some coffee. Now, here I have the Barista Express, the original barista machine. 15 years ago, we introduced this product and still carries its weight in gold. This product really introduced this idea of a hybrid approach, a fully analog manual approach to making espresso, while offering just enough automation with the volumetrics and the onboard grinder system to make espresso at home accessible to anyone. Now, you've probably had a little bit of time to tinker with this product by now, but if not, either way, today what we're going to do is make sure that every time you approach this machine, you have an intentional idea of what you're trying to do, and if something goes wrong, you know how to fix it. So this whole process is called dialing in. So let's go ahead and get started. First things first, we need some coffee. So opening up our hopper, I'm going to reach for a vacuum canister. This is a great way to maintain freshness of your coffee, not mandatory, but what it does is it makes sure that oxygen stays out so that the CO2 stays within the coffee. Now, when you have coffee that's roasted, CO2 naturally occurs and immediately begins to dissipate. So what we want to do is try to maintain freshness by keeping as much of that CO2 intact as possible. So when you're shopping for coffee, there's a lot of different ways to go about it, but obviously for this product, we have a grinder, so we want whole bean coffee. Now, aside from that, you're gonna notice a couple different iterations of date markings. What we wanna look for is a roasted date. You could also find a best by date or even an expiration date. The roast date is really key because it helps us know the time in which that CO2 began to dissipate. We really want to look for a roast date within about 30 days. That's preferable. Anything outside of that by no means is bad. It just means that what you pay for, all that flavor, all that deliciousness that's inside the coffee is starting to lose its essence. So the fresher it is, the more access you have to all that goodness. And then after that, it just slowly starts to kind of flatten out. So with espresso as the brew method here, CO2 is even more important because it adds a layer of resistance so that you can better maintain the flow rate. So when I say flow rate, really I'm talking about the entirety of what it means to make espresso, because what's happening is we're taking a portafilter, we're putting coffee in that basket, and we're letting 9 bars of pressure come crashing down on that coffee. Now, if we don't have enough resistance to hold back that water, it's gonna look for the path of least resistance, and all of a sudden you have a really watery, bitter cup of coffee. We don't want that. So what we need to maintain, and what our responsibility as the baristas in this scenario, is finding the right grind size to hold back that water. So when I talk about grind size in this case, I'm talking about making sure that the pieces of coffee are small enough to shield back and hold back that water. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, before we do that, there's a few components that I want to mention. Now, when you bring home your espresso machine and unbox it, you'll receive a couple different accessories, and they all neatly tuck away inside our accessories drawer here. The only ones I'm really going to talk about today, though, are our baskets and then the razor tool, because that's going to help us get the right dose. When I say dose, I simply mean how much coffee, right? So at the end of the day, espresso making is a recipe. How much coffee, how much water. So on machines like this, which are volumetric, meaning they automatically stop after a certain amount of water has passed through them, meaning the volume, what we're responsible for is finding the right amount of coffee to complement that amount of water. So there's a couple different ways to go about it. I'm going to take a basket, flip it upside down, and use that to pull out the basket that's currently in here. Just using that lip, and then you can pull it out. So how do you know which basket to use? Well, there's 2 different styles and then 2 different sizes. So let's cover it real quick. So the two different sizes are really straightforward. Your single and your double. More and less coffee go inside both of these baskets, and they serve the same purpose to hold the grounds and allow the water to pass through. We're going to be sticking with the double basket today because that's kind of the best recipe for how much coffee will make a really balanced double shot of espresso. Now, if you do want to stick to just the single, you totally can. Just know that your recipe will be a little bit different than what we're talking about today. Okay, so the other part of it is the different styles. So both of these baskets look almost identical, right? If we look down the middle of them, they have a bunch of holes at the bottom, but what's really unique is when we turn them around, we then see something completely different. So the one that has holes front and back, that's a single wall basket. That's what we're using today because we're using freshly roasted coffee. Now the alternative there is what's called a dual wall or pressurized basket. The pressurized basket is really helpful for a couple different scenarios. Let's say you're using pre-ground coffee. So maybe your regular caffeinated coffee is in your hopper, and then you just want to quickly switch to a pre-ground decaf option as well. Well, that pre-ground coffee is probably not ground either fine enough or it's not really specifically the right grind size because there's a lot of grind options. So since you can't change that grind size, you're going to want to ensure that you hold back that water long enough. So the pressurized basket, because the back has an additional layer, there's only one exit hole in this basket. And what that does is it engineers back pressure. So it's going to help assist in making sure that that water doesn't pass through too quickly and then, well, ruining your shot of espresso because it's under extracted. So if you're using pre-ground coffee or coffee that might not be super fresh and you're finding it really difficult to hold that water back long enough, this is a really great way to kind of get to a decent end product without wasting a bunch of coffee. So today, fresh coffee, so we're using the single wall basket, okay? So just simply pop the basket into your portafilter and then we're ready to go. Another thing, when we set up our work area, right, our espresso bar, something that's really helpful to maintain cleanliness and just like a really comfortable experience is having some rags. I like to have one rag dry that I use for wiping out my portafilter, and then another one that's slightly damp that I'll use for my steam wand. So we'll place that over here. Okay, I'm gonna put these baskets back in this accessories bin. Keep them nice and tucked away. And let's go ahead and start talking about step one in dialing in, which is the grinder. So on the Barista Express, we're going to take our portafilter and put it into the cradle or the forks. And the cradle has a button on the back of it, okay? So when I push the portafilter to the back, it's going to engage that grinder. So what's happening as soon as the grinder engages is, aside from obviously grinding coffee, it's running off of a timer. So the timer is what's going to dictate how much coffee ends up in my basket, right? If the grinder runs for 10 seconds versus 15 seconds, it's gonna have more or less coffee. So our job is to figure out how long the grinder runs for. And that's what this dial right here is for, where it says grind amount. Now, we also need to make sure that we have our filter size selected to double, because that's going to immediately tell the algorithm on the timer a preset starting point of which amount of coffee we're selecting. Because obviously a double and a single are going to default have different amounts of coffee. So have that selected, and then let's just start with the dial right in the middle, as you can see. Now there is a notch at the very top, but I'm talking about having it right at 3 o'clock, okay? That's a really good starting point. And then you'll also notice this accessory. This is a dosing funnel, extremely helpful when it comes to obviously dosing, but also ensuring that you have enough coffee in your basket without making a huge mess. Additionally, I have a scale and a knockbox. You can just use a waste basket, whatever is convenient for you. I heavily recommend investing in a knockbox. It just makes everything easier. Now, if you don't have a scale, totally fine. We can also use the razor to calibrate our dose, and I'll show you how. If you do have a scale, just make sure that you place your portafilter on your scale and simply hit tare or 0 to make sure that we're not weighing the actual portafilter, we're only weighing the amount of coffee that goes into the portafilter. So let's see what that would look like. So we're on 0, we have our dosing funnel already on, portafilter's ready to go. So now we can put this whole system into the cradle, push to the back, and we're ready to go. All right, now that the grinder is done, we can just set the portafilter with the coffee and dosing funnel back on the scale, and now we can see how much coffee we have. Now, a good frame of reference is using about 18 to 22 grams of coffee for a double basket. So we're right in that zone, so we know that our dose is spot on. That knocks out a variable completely, and because of the timer, it's going to stay relatively close unless we make a really big grind adjustment. Okay? So now what's really important is we're going to do what's called distribution. Now, remember, we're taking a little bit of coffee and crashing a little bit of water with a lot of intense pressure. So we need to make sure that this puck, this amount of coffee, is distributed evenly so that we have even density across that basket, because otherwise the water, being very lazy, will find that path of least resistance, otherwise known as channeling. So we want to make sure we break up any clumps and get it as even as possible before we tamp, okay? Now, because we're using this dosing funnel, we can actually just use the palm of our hand to give it some slight taps. And this is a really easy way to settle those grinds, remove any excess air that's inside the basket already, and gives us a really great starting point before we even go to tamp. Now, there's two ways that we can proceed. We can keep that dosing funnel on, reach for our tamp, which is magnetically stored conveniently, and then we can tamp directly into that dosing funnel. I actually prefer to take off the dosing funnel. Whichever one feels right to you, go that route. Now, if you don't, and this is also a little bit better for a visualization of how all of this comes together. Now, you can see that my bed of coffee is no longer a big mound. It's a lot more settled and already relatively compacted. So our job is to make sure that when we tamp the coffee, we're coming down as perpendicular as possible, because we don't want to push the coffee in any one direction. We want to make sure that we're, again, creating even density. So when you grab your tamp, you're going to grab it like a flashlight or a doorknob, okay? You're not going to hold it like this. You're not going to hold it like this. You're going to hold it like this. You want your index finger and your thumb to act as a pivot point so that you can reference where the edge of your basket is, and also ensure that you're not putting strain on your wrist, but you can hold it in a way that puts all the pressure up against your entire forearm. So these are just barista ergonomics, right? Once you have your portafilter down, you can use a tamp mat, you can put it under a washcloth, whatever you want to protect your counter. But either way, holding it like a doorknob, you're going to come perfectly perpendicular, place the tamp on top of your basket, and before you add any pressure, just give it a little bit of a twist so that you can feel if you're level. Once you feel like you're level, just put your weight on top of the basket and just allow your own body weight to push down. This is the easiest way to ensure that you're being consistent. If you're using the muscles in your arm to apply pressure, it's really hard to repeat. It's also strenuous. So if you allow your own body weight to be that anchor point, it doesn't matter if you tamp the same as I do, as long as you're tamping the same every time, okay? So you'll kind of feel the coffee move and then stop. At that point, you have tamped hard enough. Don't obsess about how much pressure you tamp, okay? At that point, you can just kind of clean up the rim a little bit, And for the most part, it's a pretty clean process and largely due to the dosing funnel. Now at this point, we have a perfectly prepared puck. Now we can go into what's called the group head, and we can start the extraction process. So coming in at a 45-degree angle, twisting it perpendicular. I could go further, but I don't need to. Just go to that 90-degree spot and you're good. Now, because I'm using a double basket, I'm going to use the 2-cup button, volumetric, right? So it's going to automatically dispense roughly 2 ounces of water and then stop. Grab a shot glass and then start your brewing process. I want to pay attention to my pressure gauge, what the flow rate looks like, and hold it up against some sort of time. All right, you can see the pressure gauge come up into the espresso range. That's telling me that I have created enough back pressure. The water is not flowing through too quickly. So that's a good sign. All right, now here's some reference points. We want to see the first drops of espresso in about 10 seconds. The first 7 seconds that you turn the machine on goes through what's called pre-infusion. Pre-infusion is just low pressure extraction. It means the pump is just barely turned on, and that allows the coffee to swell a little bit as the water starts trickling onto it before you hit it with a lot of pressure, and this creates a little bit more even extraction. So start seeing drips around 10 seconds. Once you see those drips, you want to finish your volume. So for the 2-cup, 2 ounces, you want that to automatically stop between 22 to 37 seconds. It seems like a big range, but it's really important to note that it completely depends on what kind of coffee you're using. Some coffees are a lot easier to extract than others. Think about a light roast versus a dark roast. Dark roasts extract very easily. Light roasts are still really dense and it's harder for water to get in and out of, okay? So use that as a frame of reference, and then always, always taste your coffee. So first off, that shot looked great. And it also tastes great. Luckily, using great coffee, fresh coffee, and playing around with the grinder a little bit. But let's go ahead and just say that the shot ran really quickly, right? Let's say it automatically stopped in 15 seconds. That was flowing way too fast. So our job would be to adjust the grinder to create more resistance and back pressure. The way we would do that is to adjust our grinder on the right side to be more fine, right? We want the pieces to be smaller to make less channels for the water to pass through. So when you do that, it's important to know you don't want to make more than, let's say, 3 clicks or 3 numerical grind changes at a time. Otherwise, you could end up kind of chasing your tail and never really end up at a great spot. So small incremental changes, and relatively soon you'll get to a really great point. And again, always taste your espresso even if you think it's outside that range, because it'll help you learn your own palate and your own preferences, because maybe you like coffee to be more on like the bright and sour side, or maybe you like the consistency to be a little bit more light and watery. It's completely up to you. Once you get to that sweet spot though, that's all that matters. And at that point, as long as you kind of take that same workflow, find ways to create consistency, you'll be knocking out great shots of espresso all week long. Now, once you get to this point, you have the basis of all traditional espresso beverages, right? So whether you're making an Americano or a long black by just adding hot water, or a cortado, cappuccino, latte, iced latte, completely up to you. It all starts with this. So put in some time to make sure that you like the way that this tastes, because then everything else is going to be magically delicious, okay? Now, that being said, let's talk about the other side of the machine. So I'm going to pivot this bad boy around a little bit. Okay, now the Barista Express has what's called a manual steam wand, which means I can manually incorporate air and heat to get the milk just how I want it. Now this part does take some practice. Just as a disclaimer, Again, don't waste anything. Don't hyper-focus what it looks like. And each time you do it, you'll slowly get better and better and better. It takes practice. Just know that. Okay, so I'm going to grab some whole milk, but let's say you can't drink milk. I also have some oat milk here. And just know that no matter what milk you're using, you can utilize the same techniques to incorporate and create really delicious microfoam that will be an amazing drinking experience. You'll be able to pour latte art with it after practice. But at the end of the day, it won't make a big difference. The only tricky part is if you're going back and forth from dairy to non-dairy. The technique will change a little bit, so just be aware they don't work the same. But if you're always doing one or the other, you'll figure out your technique. And again, we're creating consistency. That is the name of the game. Or let's call it repeatability even, okay? So the way we do everything, we want to try to build in some sort of a rhythm that we can repeat comfortably time and time again. Ooh, and that will make our lives so much easier and less frustrating. Okay, so I have whole milk, and the reason for that is it just ends up being a really good balance of proteins and fats. And those are two things that work hand in hand when it comes to creating a really stable foam. Now, I'm not going to go down all of the rabbit holes of how steaming milk works, but I am going to help you understand the technique and why you do it the way that you do it. So for starters, cold milk is a really helpful starting point. You can even put your milk jug in the fridge, and that'll help as well, because the more time you have to steam your milk, the easier it'll get. Now, you want to fill your milk jug to where it's just a little bit below the bottom of the spout. So my milk comes up to right about here. So use that as a starting point, and then just know that regardless of what vessel you're pouring into, you'll need to change that just a little bit. Now I have my milk. Gonna put this away. Keep our station nice and tidy. And before we start steaming, I'm going to put my steam wand down towards the drip tray into this hole, and I'm going to turn it on. The reason for that is because we have a thermocoil that's heating water for coffee and for steam. The coffee side needs to be heated to around 200 degrees Fahrenheit. But when we pivot to steam, it skyrockets up to about 270 degrees Fahrenheit. So you'll notice it takes just a little bit of time for it to make that change. Once you see steam, you can turn it off, and that helps to make sure that you're not introducing hot water into your milk. So that's called purging your steam wand. Okay, two different perspectives, let's call it, that we need to focus on. One is the depth of the steam wand into the milk, and the other is the position of where the steam wand is in the jug. We need to be doing two things, okay? We need to be creating a whirlpool, because all the foam that we create, we don't want it to just be building on top of itself. We want it to be incorporating. So by creating a whirlpool, we're constantly mixing the milk at the same time. So for that perspective, I want you to envision that this jug is broken up into 4 quadrants, and you just want to make sure that the tip of the steam wand is in one of those quadrants, not in the middle, right? The other one is in 2 parts. We're going to make sure that we're off to the side and that the tip of the steam wand is below the surface of the milk to start. As soon as we turn on our steam wand, we're going to let it build up to pressure again. And as soon as we hear the steam wand really kick in, we're going to slowly pull down on our jug so that the steam wand is breaking the surface of the milk. This is going to create what sounds like paper tearing. And what that's doing is it's forcing air into the milk. You'll notice I'm not moving my jug around a lot, right? I'm keeping it pretty much in the same spot, and I want to continue this sound of that paper tearing until the jug feels like it's about body temperature. That's the temperature that the fats will start to dissolve inside the milk, and we no longer want to introduce air at that point. So I can feel the jug warming up, so I'm going to submerge the tip of the steam wand. At that point, I didn't make any other movement, really subtle. I just dunked the steam wand back into the milk. It's still spinning, but no longer introducing air. I'm always keeping my fingers on the bottom of the steam wand as a temperature guide. Now, it might take a while for you to calibrate your sensitivity to heat, but as a starting point, if it feels too hot to touch, it will surely be too hot to drink. If you do like your milk extra hot, simply remove your fingers, count to 5, and then turn it off. All right? Now, once we have immediately wiped off our steam wand, which remember, our handy dandy damp rag that we had ready to go, we wiped our steam wand, and then we're going to immediately put the steam wand back into the drip tray and purge to make sure that no extra milk gets stuck up inside. For just a few seconds, and that's it. Okay, so now we have a shot of espresso, which we're going to pour into a slightly larger vessel. And we have our steamed milk. When you're done with your steamed milk, it should kind of look like wet paint, right? And the more air you introduce, obviously, the more viscous it will be. Give it a nice little swirl to reincorporate that foam that you created. Tilt your mug to the side. Pour from a standard height. Get it half full and then get really, really close. All right, so whether you pour latte art or let's just call it some accidental foam art, either way, what really matters is that you're creating the texture, because that's the drinking experience. So you have a drink that will, from top to bottom, have a nice foamy experience. It's all about that texture. And then just know that latte art at one point in time was an accident because someone poured at the right flow rate to where the density of the foam matched the density of the foam being mixed with the espresso, and it started to float to the top. So play around with that, be patient, know that it will come in time, but it doesn't really matter what it looks like. Just know that you made an espresso that was delicious. You steamed milk that had the perfect microfoam texture, and you're just combining them. And the way in which you combine them will change the way it looks. It won't change the way that it tastes as long as individually you did those two things. All right, that's all, friends. Thank you so much for joining. We'll see you soon.